In this Magic Legends video, we're going to be taking a look at all the red spells or red cards in Magic Legends, the creatures, enchantments, and sorceries, etc. Let's begin with sorceries first. The first spell is the iconic Earthquake spell. This spell does damage in a huge AoE around you, and you can hold down the cast button to continue to drain mana to keep doing damage longer and longer in an AoE around you. Shock is just a really cheap damaging small AoE ability. You can cast it at range and it'll target an area, a small area, and do damage to all the targets there. Burning Rage is a sorcery that taunts nearby enemies for 8 seconds, and for 8 seconds your primary attack, whichever that is for whatever class you are, is going to deal additional 50% damage to the enemies you hit with it. Fire Dance is a sorcery that deals damage over time very, very rapidly to random enemies around you. So this is a good way to just soften enemies up while you're attacking them with either your primary attacks or if you're using other spells into them. Lightning Strike is simply a line damaging ability spell. It's going to shoot like a lightning bolt forward that's going to do a lot of damage. It has a bit of a thinner line compared to other lines, so you're going to target a little bit more precisely. Seismic Grasp is a cone spell that deals damage in front of you while pulling the enemies to you, so if you want to group enemies up, this is a good spell to use. Slag Strike is a sorcery that allows you to charge to a single target and deal incredibly high damage, and it also deals 100% extra damage to them if they have a damage over time effect on them. So if you want to throw a dot down on an enemy and then use this ability, you're going to hit for massive, massive damage. Active Treason is a sorcery that allows you to take control of target creature for 8 to 15 seconds. That creature is going to gain greater haste and greater swiftness, so it's going to move faster and attack faster while you have control of it. This is a great way to grab a really threatening monster or creature and turn it against, a bunch of smaller creatures so it can wreak havoc on them. Earth Spike is another line damaging spell. It's going to deal damage in a straight line. It's a bit wider than Lightning Strike, so you can hit more foes with it a lot more easily. Pyroclasm is an AoE that triggers off your character. It's going to deal initial damage to all the characters that are nearby to you, and then it's going to deal damage to them over time as well. So it's just going to, whatever it hits with that initial blast, they're going to have a dot on them. Fatal Frenzy buffs the highest power creature you have for a certain amount. Whatever their power is, it's going to buff it by that much for 10 seconds, and then it's going to sacrifice the creature. This is going to increase the size of the creature and the damage that it deals significantly, usually, but then it's going to die. So this is best used on a creature that's probably going to die fairly soon anyway, because you don't want to sacrifice your best creature for it to do a little bit more damage. Elemental Shatter is an interesting spell because it creates a hazard at a target location that taunts all foes. So all foes are then going to come to it, and then after 3 seconds, it's going to detonate. So the idea is that you throw it, enemies are lured to it, and then it explodes and kills them, hopefully. Goblin Bombardment is a fantastic line damaging spell. It's not only a very fat line and a long line, but it hits for 100% additional damage to foes at full health. This makes it a really, really good opening spell. Char is a damage dealing spell that hits in a cone in front of you and then shoots you backwards. So if you're kind of surrounded by enemies, this is a good spell to use to not only deal damage to a whole bunch of them, but also to get you out of there. Lava Vortex is a ground targeted AoE you can throw it wherever you want that's basically going to swirl and deal damage over 10 seconds. It's a great thing to throw into just mobs of enemies as it just continuously damages them. Molten Shell is a fantastic spell that not only gives you a shield for 10 seconds that protects you from a ton of damage, but for 10 seconds, it also deals damage to enemies around you. So as you move around, you're going to be, ticking these dots that hit everyone around you. And since, if you're playing the Geomancer class, you tend to melee, this works really well if you're in melee range. Magma Burst is another cone damaging spell, but what's great about this one is it deals 100% more damage to enemies affected with damage over time effects. So again, you want to set them up with some sort of dot and then blast them away with Magma Burst. Bathe and Dragonfire might be one of the coolest looking spells in the game. A dragon swoops in and deals damage in a line, then drops a fire effect on the ground that continues to deal damage over 5 seconds. This is a great way to start a fight or to just wipe out a ton of enemies all at once. Ghitu Lavarunner is a very good creature for 1 mana. It's a 1/2, which means it's going to be a little bit more tanky than your standard 1/1. And whenever you cast a sorcery, it's going to gain +1/+0 for 10 seconds. So if you have a lot of sorceries in your deck, this might be a good choice for you. Goblin Offensive is a fantastic spell. If you press it for 2 mana, you'll get a 1/1 goblin, but if you hold it down, you'll continue to get 1/1 goblins per 1 mana spent, so you can summon a ton of goblins really quickly and build a massive army. Goblin Firebomber is a 2/2 creature that can chuck bombs that deal an AoE damage over time, which is great because not too many creatures have that ability, but it also does an AoE to nearby foes around it when it dies, so it's kind of a double whammy. You want it to stay alive, and then you don't mind so much when it dies. Juvenile Kavu is good for decks with a lot of sorceries like red, because whenever you cast one, it's going to deal damage and damage over time to random foes in different areas. So if you're going to cast a lot of sorceries, it's going to be proccing this ability rather regularly, which is great. Flametongue Kavu does pretty good damage. It's a 4/2 creature for 3 mana, which is good, and it does a lot of damage on foes in a line. So it's another creature that can do damage to foes in a line, so it's good when there's a lot of enemies out. Lightning Elemental makes an appearance in the game, and it's a fantastic card here. It's a 6/1 creature, so it dies rather easily, but it has a really good summon effect, which it deals damage and stuns enemies where you cast it, and then it uses that special ability the longer it stays alive. So it will repeat using this like every 10 seconds or so, as long as you can keep it alive, and it does pretty good damage being a 6 power. Earth Elemental is really, really nice for this color. It's a 3/5 creature, which is rather beefy. It's really hard to kill, but what I really like is that when you summon it, it taunts all foes for 5 seconds. So if you summon this in a group of enemies, like you're like, oh crap, there's so many enemies. If you summon it, it's going to take the heat off you for a while, and it can also deal substantial damage to foes in front of it, so it can hit more than just one target. Emberlings are a 2/1 creature for 4 mana, which is kind of expensive, but you get 3, which is great. And the nice thing about that is, anytime you're playing a deck where you want a lot of creatures, this is a good card. But also, it deals damage in an AoE when it dies. So it's not as much of a loss. You're going to get damage out of it. If it runs into a crowd, kills a couple enemies, and then dies, it might kill a bunch more. Goblin Warchief is fantastic in a deck with a lot of creatures, but even more so in a deck with goblins. Other creatures you control are going to gain +1/+0 when he's out, so they're going to be a little bit bigger, they're going to do a little bit more damage. But goblins also gain greater swiftness, increasing their movement speed, meaning they should get to their targets faster and be able to attack more often. Galvanized Dreadnaught is a pretty beefy creature at 4/6. It costs 6 mana. Its projectiles pass through enemies, which is good. And what's really great about it is it does damage and knocks down a foe in front of it periodically, so it's going to interrupt maybe a tough enemy trying to kill it. It might prevent it from dying a lot more often by knocking it down every so often. But it also has the activated ability, if you draw this card again while it's out on the battlefield and play it, instead of recasting the creature, you'll actually give it +4/-3, so it'll have a lot more damage, sacrifice some of that toughness to boost its damage for 10 seconds. Ogre Mortar is a really interesting card. It's a 5/4 creature for 6 mana. It doesn't seem to attack for much damage in my experience, but it does shoot out periodically goblin tokens. So every so often you're going to deal damage in an area where it shoots this goblin, and it's going to spawn a goblin, and when it dies, it's going to summon 3 1/1 goblin tokens for 30 seconds. So it's a great way to get more creatures onto the battlefield, and also lose creatures. Might work very well with like a black deck, for instance. The Werewolf Shaman is 7 mana for 2/3 creature, which is quite expensive, but its special ability is fantastic. Every so often, it's going to summon a 2/2 wolf creature for 30 seconds, and these are just going to keep attacking enemies, and as long as you keep this person on the battlefield in combat, they're just going to keep summoning wolves every so often, which is great. If you ever get 4 or more, which you won't do without some other cards, because it seems to cap out at 3. By the time you reach 3, the first one will disappear and it'll summon another one. But if you ever get 4, it's going to transform and gain lesser swiftness and +3/+0, so it's going to turn into like a werewolf or whatever and be really powerful. The iconic card Shivan Dragon makes an appearance. It's a pretty beefy card, 6/6 for 7 mana, and it deals damage in an AoE wherever you summon it, which is great, so make sure you throw it into a group of enemies when you call it down. And it also does like a fire breath attack that hits enemies in front of it for like a certain amount of damage. Magma Colossus is 8 mana for a 6/4, which is quite expensive, but it can attack from melee or ranged, and when it attacks from ranged, it gains trample, which basically means that its attack hits multiple targets, not just one. I'm going to cover the 2 artifact creatures here as well, because you can use them in a red deck or a red and whatever color deck. They will also be accepted, so I'm going to cover them here just so that you can see what they do. Experimental Scorpion is a 3/3 for 4 mana, and it costs 1 less for each other artifact creature you control. There aren't too many artifact creatures currently in the beta, so this isn't going to be particularly useful. What's really great is that when it dies, it's going to spawn 3 1/1 spiraling artifact creature tokens for 30 seconds. So again, if you're playing a deck that you need creatures to die or come onto the battlefield, this is a very good card to have. And Experimental Sentinel is really beefy. It's a 5/5 for 6 mana, and what's great is when an artifact creature enters the battlefield under your control, you heal for a lot. So this synergizes really well with Experimental Scorpion, because when it dies, it pops those 3 onto the battlefield to heal for all of them, which is fantastic. It can also charge forward in a line, dealing damage in a line to enemies. Moving on to enchantments. Enchantments all last for 30 seconds in Magic Legends. They're basically sorceries that last for 30 seconds, but they're not sorceries. So if you have an effect that says cast a sorcery, it must be a sorcery, but essentially, they're just longer lasting spells. Goblin Rush is the first one, and it makes it for 30 seconds. Whenever you cast a sorcery, you create a 1/1 goblin creature token for 30 seconds. So again, if you're playing a deck that gets rewarded for having a lot of creatures out, or from creatures dying, this is a good card to have. Fuming Onslaught is an enchantment that makes it so creatures are cheaper to cast, and they gain greater swiftness and greater haste, so they're going to move faster and they're going to attack faster. but they die 15 seconds after entering the battlefield. So this card is probably going to do very well in like a black-red deck, where sacrificing creatures actually gives you some benefit or something happens when they die. Furnace of Wrath is the only enchantment I've seen that actually lasts longer than 30 seconds so far. It lasts 42 seconds, and you gain greater might, which means you're going to deal more damage, but you also gain greater vulnerability, which means you're going to take more damage. So this is kind of a high-risk, high-reward enchantment. It's going to make all your spells deal more damage, but you're going to take more damage. Mark of Immolation for 30 seconds. Whenever a creature you control dies, that creature deals 200% of its damage to nearby foes. This synergizes very nicely, obviously, with Fuming Onslaught. However, they both cost lots of mana, so it might be hard to get them both out at once. But again, this might go nicely in a deck where creatures are dying often or being sacrificed like a black deck. That's all for the red cards for Magic Legends. We're going to have videos on all the other colors, blue, white, green, black as well, so make sure you check those out. And make sure you check out the wiki if you need information about the game. We're going to have all these cards on there so you can see what they do, read any tips and things we have on them, because I've been adding some to there slowly. But we're going to have everything you can imagine, and we're just going to keep working on that wiki throughout the beta.